Hitachi Energy is proud to partner with the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Powering Purpose is a new book resulting from the partnership between Hitachi Energy and Monocle. It tells the story of the people and the technology leading the energy transition and ushering in a sustainable and secure future. Hitachi Energy and Monocle work together to provide inspiration on powering people's lives and where to find the energy for change in the era of electrification. Secure your copy now at monocle.com or in store in Monocle outlets around the world. And if you want to understand the role you can play in harnessing connections to ensure a brighter, more sustainable and secure future, head to hitachienergy.com. Hitachi Energy and Monocle, inspiring the energy for change.
Incumbent national governments and leaders usually regard mid-term elections, like by-elections and/or state and local elections, with a certain weary trepidation, well aware that voters often regard these as an opportunity to take a free swing at those in power. For incumbent national governments and leaders embarked upon radical and/or controversial reforms, such elections are even more hazardous. If the voters decide to stuff your parliament with your opponents, your country's cartoonists will swiftly start sketching you as a duck on crutches. Such were the stakes contemplated by rumbustious Argentinian President Javier Milei ahead of last weekend's mid-term elections, in which half of the Chamber of Deputies and a third of the Senate were up for grabs. To the surprise of many, possibly including President Milei himself, voters effectively invited him to give his famous chainsaw another rev. Milei's La Libertad Avanza party roughly doubled their presence in both houses. Much coverage of President Milei to date has focused on his personal eccentricities, which is understandable, as they are considerable. During the campaign, for example, he launched his latest book by performing a 9-song set of Argentinian rock classics from the stage of a Buenos Aires arena. This Argentinian demagogue is not waiting around for 2 Englishmen to write his musical. But Milei's brutal hacking of public spending has delivered a budget surplus, Argentina's long rampant inflation has been curbed, growth is up, unemployment down. Perhaps there is method in the apparent madness. How did Milei convince voters to stay the course? Is what Milei is doing, strange though it, and indeed he may seem, actually working? And how did Argentina end up needing such drastic medicine in the first place? This is the Foreign Desk.
Argentina is in such a dire crisis. They would take anything over remaining in the same place.
Yes, you are achieving, but at what cost?
In so many ways, it's a rupture with immediate past and with Argentine history in general.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Vera Bergengruen, national security reporter at The Wall Street Journal, who has covered President Milei's rise. Vera, first of all, how unexpected is this result? It's pretty unusual anywhere in the world for incumbent national governments to do well at midterm elections.
That's right. I mean, it was quite surprising, partly because the polls were off, as tends to happen sometimes. But his party, Milei's party, La Libertad Avanza, had been quite beaten in the provincial elections. And, a little bit, there was quite some warning signs that his party was in trouble for these midterm elections. And so the expectations were that it was going to be quite close and that the people might turn against his reforms, that they were kind of done with the pain, the tolerance was gone, that the tide was turning against him because President Milei's issue from the start, given the austerity measures, given that things haven't quite improved for most Argentines, was how long the public was still going to support him. So, it was quite unexpected in that way because I think the expectations were that quite a few people were fed up. There was quite a few corruption scandals, and there was a reason to believe that it might happen. So I think because those expectations were set, it was a bit surprising.
I mean, we have only had a few days for pollsters to figure out what they missed, but has there been any thinking on that front? I mean, all the reasons you've listed are perhaps good reasons to assume that these elections might not have gone well for the incumbent president, but are Argentinians just more patient than they were being given credit for? Were the pollsters asking the wrong people? Do we know what happened?
I think one of the things is that the turnout was quite exceptionally low. I think the participation was around 67, 68%, and it's usually voting is compulsory. So I think it's the lowest actually since the 80s. So to an extent, that means that the voting was selective, right? And a lot of people just didn't show up. So that was one of the reasons that it might have been, people who really wanted to support him did turn out. So that was one of the reasons. And the other, I think, from speaking to quite a few analysts and also people around him, is that, it was maybe also less of a enthusiastic endorsement for him and more of a rejection of a lot of the leftist populist policies that got Argentina into this mess. And so a lot of people were more willing to vote for him or not vote at all than to vote for the other side. They don't want to return that way. Even though things are bad now, they kind of feel like they've stuck it out for, a year and a half or so since almost 2 years since his election. And they would rather see it out for the possibility of getting Argentina out of this crisis rather than going backwards.
Because I think outside Argentina in particular, where Milei obviously attracts most of such coverage as there is of Argentinian politics, it was, I think, assumed that this election would be basically a referendum on him personally. Is that a fair way to think about these elections, or were there other issues besides the president that Argentinians were voting on?
It did ultimately boil down to that. Also, partly, I think, because of the way that the last couple of weeks before the vote unfolded. I mean, President Milei came to Washington. He met with President Trump. There's this massive, $20 billion basically bailout currency swap on the table. And the United States or President Trump made it really clear that that would be conditional on his victory, right? So there was a lot of things in the last couple of weeks that really ended up pinpointing this as a referendum on Milei himself and his general policies and his party. But again, I think the biggest thing was this idea of, change over pain. People just kind of deciding, okay, we would rather just stick it out with him, maybe less because we think he's the ideal president. But, Argentina is in such a dire crisis. It's really kind of hard to explain to people who haven't been there or don't speak to people there. They would take anything over remaining in the same place. And it's quite remarkable, again, because the austerity measures are hurting regular Argentines in most ways. And his policies haven't yet really improved the quality of life and the financial situation of almost any Argentines. So it really just shows, I think, to an extent, yes, it was about him, but it was about the level of desperation the country still finds itself in, that they would much rather take the chance of getting out of this rather than, sticking with what they've been doing.
That being the case, is his support actually fairly broad-based, or is there a typical or characteristic Milei voter? Is there even a stereotype of who his people are? I mean, he's often compared to US President Donald Trump, and I think there is a fairly well-entrenched stereotype at large of who and what a Trump voter is. Is there anything of the sort for Milei's people?
To an extent, yes, in terms of the people who are publicly supportive, right? Or the people who are very publicly huge Milei fans. Part of his most visible support was, young men, angry young men. We've seen this before. People who were quite right-wing, people who were, upset about the pandemic measures at the time. And that was the kind of people who often were publicly supportive. He has a huge kind of online fan base, I would say. It's international, but there's a lot of people who are, constantly putting out pro-Milei talking points, things like that. That is kind of it's not too different from many far-right or right-wing parties in Europe and some other parts of the world. But then there's this massive, often kind of more silent majority, right? That, again, just cannot stomach more of the same. I mean, he was running when he was elected. He was running against the former economy minister. So it was something, they just couldn't really do that. So I think there's quite a large segment of the population that prefer to vote for change, who aren't maybe the typical Milei voter. The typical Milei voter and the typical Milei lawmaker that we've seen come into office tends to be quite a bit more unorthodox and quite more colorful, I would say.
I mean, does he seem, with all due acknowledgement that it's often quite hard to tell what President Milei actually thinks about anything, but did he seem braced for defeat, and does he now seem somewhat surprised by the result?
That's a great question. I interviewed him last year, and I profiled him for Time Magazine at the time, and spent a lot of time with some of his inner circle and interviewed them. So it's the thing about him is he is the most convinced of his own victory and his own righteousness. He is, a former economics professor, a pundit, and again, quite an eccentric figure. And when you interview him, when you speak with him, I mean, he is so 100% convinced that his ideas are right, that his economic theories on how to get the country out of this mess are right. And, maybe there's some doubt in the people around him, but he is 100% convinced. And so it's quite an unusual, I think, personality type for most world leaders who allow a bit more nuance in there. So I wouldn't be surprised if he, was a bit concerned, but generally was convinced he was going to pull it off.
Well, just finally then, and perhaps thinking back to that interview, he now has what he can certainly interpret as a new mandate. He has a presidential election to look forward to, not really all that far away, and a chance to be re-elected. What did he talk about at the time about the future? Does he have an endpoint in mind as to what Argentina will look like by the time he's done with it?
He does quite have an absolutist view in that sense. I mean, in his mind, there was basically the dark ages of the leftist politics that have defined Argentina for decades. And he is bringing them out of that. And it's not just economic, right? It's cultural, it's political. He closed the women's office. He closed all of these. He's quite right-wing and quite ideological in that way. He wants to transform Argentine society. He talks a lot about freedom of speech. And so in his mind, this is not just an economic plan. He's not just there to slowly kind of start to get them out of this crisis financially. He's there to just remake Argentine society in Argentine politics. And, that is something that is, I guess, less popular, obviously, in Argentina as a whole, which is often, it's quite Catholic. There's a lot of other things about that society that maybe don't agree. They would much rather he just focus on the economic part. But when I interviewed him, at least, he kind of saw himself as the, tip of the spear of a broader revolution. And as I said, I think in his mind, he is so convinced that he is right. I think he thinks that this last vote is in some ways kind of miraculous, and that it's going to give him the momentum he needs to do this. And what's important to him in many ways is putting Argentina back on the map, the international support, seeing his own, I'm a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. We had a big photo of him on the front page, and he was incessantly tweeting it, reposting it. He likes to see the world pay attention to him and to Argentina. And to him, any attention, it means that he's putting his country back, he's making it relevant. He's making it a model that other countries want to emulate if this experiment succeeds. So I think for him, that's kind of how he sees the future, right? He's put Argentina on the map, partly due to the sheer force of his own personality. And he sees that as a success on its own. So it's going to be quite interesting to see what happens and how much further the Argentine public is willing to support him.
That was Vera Bergengruen, national security reporter at the Wall Street Journal. This is the Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. President Milei has not yet enacted his two most treasured economic policies, the abolition of Argentina's central bank and the replacement of Argentina's peso with the US dollar. It may be that this is where his ambition has run up against reality. Well, joining us now for a look at if and why the reforms Milei has been able to make may be working is Paula Diosquez-Rice, Economics Associate Director at S&P Global, specializing in Latin American macroeconomics. Paula, first of all, by a way of establishing some kind of benchmark, if we go back to when President Milei was running for the job, what problems, as he saw it, did Argentina have that needed solving? What were the economic woes he wanted to address?
So when he ran for president, he came in under the banner of dollarizing the economy because he saw that as the only means for Argentina to solidify reducing the chronic fiscal deficit, which was in turn being subsidized by the central bank's printing money, which led to Argentina's hyperinflation. So in order to just fully eliminate that, he said, well, Argentina needs to dollarize the economy, and then no other government could run deficits that high and print money to just pay for that. he has changed his view in the sense that he is no longer looking to dollarize. Dollarizing an economy when you have a central bank with a huge liability is not an easy task. So instead, he started by trying to clear up this balance sheet of the central bank, moving those deficits to actual surplus now. He has done a lot of cut in the spending and was able to switch that to actual surplus. And the next thing was reduce the inflation rate. And the base to doing that was, if I have a zero deficit or even a surplus, I don't need to print money. We will slowly converge to a much lower monthly inflation rate. We're currently at 2% monthly inflation rate, which is much lower than when he started. So it is happening.
This is what we wanted to figure out, because obviously a lot of the foreign coverage, in particular of President Milei, tends to focus on his somewhat eccentric personal style. But is it possible to say that what he is doing is actually working? The inflation, I mean, it's quite weird talking about a country with 32% annual inflation and saying that's an improvement, but it actually is. It was 300% as recently as April 2024. Growth is now running at around 5%. There is, as you say, a budget surplus. Is this evidence of Milei's program actually working as it's supposed to work?
Yes, I mean, these are your goals and you are on your way to achieving them. The problem is, how do you achieve those goals? Part of the turning into a surplus is that he didn't adjust for inflation pensions. And so you do see that part of the population has actually paid for this retrenchment, in fiscal spending. And so consumption on their side and their well-being suffered. So you're going to have some pushback on, yes, you are achieving, but at what cost? So now the problem is, how do you move ahead and not undo what your achievements were and still take care of that side of the population? And so that is the bigger task moving forward. Still have zero fiscal deficit, but take care of your population at the same time. Otherwise, you will not have enough support to win a re-election or continue with your program that it is actually bearing fruits.
The other big headline, of course, that attended this election campaign before the election was this decent-sized bailout, $40 billion in total from the United States. Is that the thing that does make the difference? Do his numbers look quite as good without that money?
So the problem that he had going into 2026 is the heavy repayment of debt coming in even in as early as January, nearly $4.5 billion US, and the country has improved in certain areas, but you still have no foreign exchange reserves. So how are you going to take care of this debt? How are you going to do this repayment? So the help or the assistance of the United States and also of the IMF early on this year has improved the chances of the country repaying this debt, continuing in this program, and giving them the opportunity to start actually accumulating those reserves. Because if the country had to just repay from what we have now, it would have to go onto market and probably not get very good funding, and that is just a snowball that continues. And the risk of default continues to be high.
Because the usual rationale advanced by governments which impose some or other regime of austerity, and we have heard rhetoric to this effect from President Milei, is that there will be short-term pain for long-term gain, that things might be a struggle in the early stages, but the medicine will take effect and everything will be lovely eventually. Has Milei put any kind of timescale on when, at the risk of mixing the metaphor, the sunlit uplands are going to be reached? Or are Argentinians just expected to endure what they're enduring indefinitely?
No, I mean, he has said that after this first 2 years of readjustment, and especially taking care of the inflation rate early on, and basically this is the pain. Now, moving forward, we're going to do this reforms that will help the country grow more sustainably. You know, you have a strong growth and you want to keep that growth. And in order to do that, we're going to have these other reforms, but it doesn't mean that there's going to be the same pain that you had the first 2 years. So he hasn't necessarily said the pain is over, but it's improving. You're having less pain going forward, and it's just a matter of changing our ways of how things have been done and haven't worked so far.
So just as a final thought then, his next big electoral test will be the actual presidential election in 2027. What to him would seem like a definition of success between now and then? What is something he could campaign for re-election on by saying it justified what Argentina has been put through?
I think in the next 2 years, if you show continued disinflation and getting the annual average of the inflation rate under the 2 digits, it's already the win for him. He wants to get that inflation rate much, much lower and towards the 5%. And if you continue on this path and you show that fiscal authority, like if you have zero deficit, you are not printing money and you're cleaning up every distortion that you still have that is not allowing you to grow sustainably, then you can show this is my success. I have lowered from 300% to 5%, or at least under the double digits. I think that's already a triumph for him. And this is something that he will run his campaign, most likely.
That was Paula Diosquez-Rice, Economics Associate Director at S&P Global. This is The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. A key plank of Milei's pitch for the presidency when he ran was the quality of Argentina's previous rulers, who he damned as, quote, a parasitic, larcenous, useless caste who were sinking the country. This much was difficult to disagree with. Amidst and after military dictatorships, Argentina has recurrently misplaced its faith in messianic nationalists such as Juan Perón and a couple of his wives, and such spiritual successors as husband and wife team Nestor and Cristina Kirchner. Well, joining me finally is Ernesto Seaman, historian of Latin America and associate professor at the University of Bergen. Ernesto, we've had a while now to get used to the idea of Javier Milei as president. Does he strike you as something genuinely new and a radical departure from Argentine history, or do you see echoes in him of people who've come before?
I would say radically yes. In so many ways, it's a rupture with immediate past and with Argentine history in general. Liberalism is not new, and it was not invented by Milei, right? Mm-hmm. The ideas of individual freedom over collective well-being, the economy above politics and ideas of social justice, the implementation of less government intervention in the economy, free trade, liberalization, none of that is new, and it's not new in Argentina either. The degree in which Milei turned that into a libertarian political program and the fanatism is radically new. And it has not been a part of Argentine politics in general. I would say not even during the most radical neoliberal crusade that was the 1976-1983 military dictatorship. Regardless of everything else, and I'm not comparing a democratic regime with a dictatorship, but you can see, mostly during the last couple of decades or so, how in the society, without a political expression, people who to some extent have seen or experienced the shortcomings of the traditional welfare state, have experienced with some forms of, individual salvation, entrepreneurship, the kind of nutrients of the libertarian agenda that were under the radar of politics and in some cases against the tendencies available in politics, but were to some extent producing a libertarian society at a specific moment, just found a political expression in Milei.
But on the subject of his political style, do you perceive anything vaguely familiar there? Because there is something of a personality cult around Milei, which he's tried to create himself and which his supporters have tried to create on his behalf. And that's not entirely new necessarily in Argentine politics. This is something that was certainly said about, Juan and Eva Perón, about the Kirchners a couple of decades later. Is there a continuity there, or is what is Milei doing in that respect something completely different as well?
We are seeing the move forward of different forms of authoritarian politics along individual charismatic leaders pretty much anywhere else. I'm sort of reluctant to see a singularity in Latin America or in Argentine politics, sure, in Latin American caudillos as a specific signifier of the region politics. I do see there's a common thing with opposite political projects of Milei and Perón, in the sense that their style break with the recent past in radical ways. Right, the way they dressed, the way they speak, the way they connect with people through emotions, the way they describe the immediate past as something fully contaminated with which they have nothing to do, even though it is not realistically possible. But I think that in general, Latin America in general, but Argentina in particular, has been in the middle of so many economic crises, extraordinarily resilient in building sort of solid and universal institutions, at least for the last 40 years, since the end of the military dictatorships in the 70s and 80s. In general, I'm more inclined to see in the region quite the opposite of this kind of personality cult, and the way institutions and societies have been able to contain those tendencies into democratic, liberal institution frameworks. As if you see the case of Argentina, in general, Milei, in the end, didn't break any rule in order to express and show the centrality of his personality. Same thing in Brazil, same thing in Uruguay, Chile, Mexico. But I don't see a particularly Latin American or particularly Argentine style in that. Again, having this conversation under Donald Trump, right?
Fair enough. But are you optimistic that those institutions you talk about survive much more of Milei? Because he does have an impatience with those structures. He does have, I think, a fairly obvious authoritarian streak. And that idea of Argentina as a democracy as such, if we date it back to the end of the military dictatorships, is not that old. It's only 40 years.
I am optimistic. I think the deepening process of trade liberalization, dismantling of government intervention and labor regulations in the economy, and creating this incredible rhetoric of cruelty against the poor, et cetera, is not something that might last forever. In fact, 7 weeks before the last midterm elections, Milei, his party was defeated with a 13-point difference. There's a lot of things to talk about what changes in those 7 weeks. One of the things that changed was the 40 billion check by Donald Trump that basically stopped a run on the peso and allowed him to run the elections in an apparently normal economy. But we were this close from a radical change and defeat of his government. So fit for these alternatives, and it will definitely allow him to consolidate his power in the longer run. It also brings him more radically into democratic institutions. These were midterm elections. Milei is no longer the isolated guy in the government house with the Congress and justice against him. Now he's going to have congressmen and representatives in the Senate and in the lower house. It will give him power to have more negotiation than confrontation with the other institutions. So I am optimistic in nature. I think not that institutions are resilient, but that people will find a way to articulate their demands in a way that would stop these authoritarian tendencies. I also think my optimism is more in the long run that I think that people will pay for cruelty in time. So it's not an immediate optimism, maybe.
Ernesto Seaman, Associate Professor at the University of Bergen, thank you for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.